So to all who may be watching, hello and welcome to our Q&A with Kinderland producer and director Amy Grappell. Okay, so Amy Grappell's documentary Quadrangle premiered at Sundance in 2010, where it won a jury prize and went on to win Best Short Film at South by Southwest, AFI, and the Dallas International Film Festival, and had its New York premiere at New Directors, New Films, MOMA, before being broadcast on HBO. She returned to Sundance in 2011 with a short documentary titled Kids Green the World. She was one of the select writer-directors of Richard Linklater's Slacker 2011, and her feature documentary Light from the East, shot in Ukraine during the fall of communism, premiered at South by Southwest, aired on PBS, and is part of the collection at the Library of Congress. Grappell holds a BA in Film and Literature from New York University, is a graduate of the MFA acting program at the North Carolina School of the Arts, and is the recipient of grants from the Austin Film Society, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Texas Council for the Humanities, and the Trull Foundation. And apparently, you're currently writing a memoir and adapting the Quadrangle story for a fictional TV series, if your bio is still accurate in that regard.
It is, yeah, I am.
Well, so welcome to Spokane Jewish Cultural Film Festival 2023, Amy Grappell. And I hope I've been pronouncing your last name right this whole time.
You are.
Good, good. All right. Well, I'm very pleased to be able to talk with you about Kinderland. As I mentioned earlier, audiences really seem to respond very well in person, and we've had some folks watching online as well. So I am going to start with what might be a fairly obvious question, which is, how did you discover Camp Kinderland and decide to make the film?
I am from New York originally, and I love upstate New York this summer. So I was actually at a friend's wedding and was walking around in the morning, taking a run, and I ran onto Kinderland's original campsite. I was blown away because the buildings were so old, they had so much personality, and I just started to explore, and I ran into a caretaker there who started telling me the story of how, this camp, had been there for 100 years and how it was, a secular Jewish summer camp. And he told me the story about how just across the lake, there was another camp, and that both camps were rivals. And he started talking about how they would war across the lake because one was socialist and the other was communist. And I just thought it was just such an interesting story that I started to do some research on it because, my grandparents, the camps were founded by Eastern European Jewish immigrants in America. And my grandparents are Eastern European immigrants as well, but they were a little bit more on the side of assimilation. They weren't really interested in instilling in me my cultural history and identity. I think they were so frightened because they fled during the war, and I was never exposed to a place that was built to keep Jewish cultural values alive outside of any sort of religious orientation. And I became fascinated. So I started out by trying to find some of the elders who were there in the 20s and 30s. And that was a long time ago. I mean,
a century ago, basically.
Yeah. And so I started filming them probably about 12 years ago because I wanted to make sure to memorialize the elders while they were still here. And once I got to know them, first of all, they're such inspiring people, some in their 90s that were so bright and so full of life because they've continued this tradition of Lador Vador, of passing on the values to the generations now. Many of them work at the camp or spend time at the camp. So,
which really says something about their belief in the camp and their commitment to its values and culture. I mean, that's not something you find at every summer camp or every Jewish institution where the elders are a very present and meaningful part of the tapestry of it. the fabric of it.
Yeah. It's really beautiful to see people in their 80s and 90s so engaged and so sharp, because they're so engaged and so needed.
Mm-hmm.
And also the young people, once I kind of gained the trust of the elders, they invited me to camp for a week. So I got to meet the campers, and that part of the film was shot, more recently before the pandemic. But I was equally blown away by these kids. They're so articulate and yeah, so empowered by this intergenerational relationship. It's really, it was really moving to me. So I felt, especially during the pandemic, kind of my role to give them voice. I don't think enough people have heard from this group. And yeah, I wanted to get them in the spotlight at least a little bit, as much as I could.
Yeah. Well, I think especially for a film that is relatively brief, I mean, it's not a short, but it's also definitely not feature length. You were able to capture so much of the, both, as you say, sort of the feelings and the thoughts of the elder generation, but also these kids. And that was one of the things that I remarked upon after rewatching the film and then talking to the audience afterwards in the lobby of the venue. These kids are amazing. And I don't know, I think you must have done a lot of talking with them, and then you really culled what feel like these gems, right? And also, particularly in some of the interviews, it seems like, and I don't know if you did the editing or if someone else did, but
I worked with a couple of different editors. It was a very hard film to edit.
well, actually, I mean, this wasn't on my list, but I'd love to hear why that is. But while I was going to say, and then I'll be done with this point, is just you were able, or your team, you combined were able to capture even some very good comic timing in terms of some of what they were talking about. The line that probably gets a lot of laughs, chuckles that are affectionate and so forth, is the dismantling capitalism, right? That really was such a great entry point into this world, and people really loved that kind of that kind of twist at the end of that camper's statement. Anyway, I would like to hear what made it a challenge to edit, particularly this film.
Well, it's a big story, and I didn't have the budget to make a feature or the capability during COVID to keep shooting. So it took a lot to be able to compress, especially the historic part. And because it was so many talking heads, I wanted it to be a visual experience. So it's always difficult when you try to overlay two people at the same time, but when you try to do four, that's challenging. And I think it was a lot of story. And for a long time, it felt like the piece with the elders, which I did first, felt like a separate movie than the piece with the kids. So it was challenging to try to weave those together. Right. And so it was a really difficult puzzle. And yeah, it took a few editors and myself to figure it out. To figure out the connective tissue that would bring the past and the present together in a way that didn't feel like two films,
Well, so, for what it's worth, I would never have known that it was so challenging by the final product.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Making movies is hard, especially documentaries when I don't think I really knew what the spine of the structure was going to be until, finally we kind of landed on it being kind of about the divisiveness of our world, and either of these two, and these two groups were kind of a metaphor for that. And even though we try and we're very close to the same side, it seems like we have a really hard time
Hmm.
joining forces, for the greater good. And I think once we landed on that, the story started to come into focus.
Hmm.
Um,
That
and
makes sense. One of the things I was going to ask you actually is, um, when I first watched the film, it struck me that Workman's Circle Camp reaching out to Camp Kinderland and the ensuing discussion, to me, does reflect the tensions and divisions, particularly within the American left today, and also specifically the Jewish left. And so I was going to ask, to what extent was that on your mind when you structured that portion of the film? But I feel like you kind of just answered that. I don't know how much that was um, something that influenced how you put the film together.
it did. I mean, it wasn't an accident. I wanted to tell the story of the campers rowing out to the middle of the lake and, you know, yelling insults at each other because very dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a surprise that I just lucked out, I guess,
Mm.
that the week I was allowed to film was the week they were coming to visit.
Yeah.
They were not too excited about me filming that because
Mm.
I think that there's a lot of mistrust in the community. There's so much anti-Semitism and so much media that's been done about the camp. I think one of Obama's cabinet members' daughters goes to the camp,
Oh, wow.
so they got a lot of flack from the Tea Party for
Mm.
that, and I think that they really do receive a lot of hate sort of sentiments. So they were scared. They didn't know me that well, and
Right.
but I think I was able to capture enough, though that scene was really challenging.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I really didn't think it was going to be the central focus, but as we continued to edit, it seemed like that kind of theme was calling our name, and it seemed like all the other pieces kind of fit under that too. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think it was a surprise that came during the editing process, and that happens with documentaries. They're like, it's like being on a roller coaster, and
Mm.
I was afraid to try that because I was like, no, that wasn't what I was thinking. But yeah, it it's a good thing that happened, because it's now, I guess some people say it's their favorite scene in the movie, because even though it doesn't really culminate into a solution, I guess it's a good representation of people trying to work together, and it's messy. So
Mhm.
it was nice to have those verite kind of scenes. I wasn't able to shoot for longer than 5 days at the camp. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, I was lucky to capture what I could in that five
Mm.
days. And I think yeah, it's just, these things take their own journey. You can
Mhm.
you can say what you want your documentary to be about when you start, but often I find that it tells you,
Mhm. You were mentioning, the desire to find some connective tissue for the film, and I was struck by two things that are both so important to Jewish tradition and history, and also are obviously still important now. And one of them is Yiddish, which wasn't a major part of the film, but whenever I see, I run a Jewish film festival, whenever I see Yiddish being not only spoken, but kind of taught to a younger generation, that's striking, because I know that's happening. I know of young adult Jewish communities as close as Seattle that are trying to speak Yiddish and be a Yiddish, culture community. But um, what, from your point of view, what do you think Yiddish's role and significance are within the culture of Camp Kinderland?
Well, I feel like it was the native tongue for the immigrants that founded the camp.
Mm.
And, in the early days, they spoke Yiddish at Camp Kinderland. So
Mm.
And it was a huge part of their curriculum.
Yeah.
They had Yiddish class every single day.
Mm.
And I think it was about them preserving their cultural history and identity. They felt like part of that was preserving their language.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it bonded them together as a group. And I think the kids now feel like, you know, a lot of the elders lived in the Lower East Side in these neighborhoods that were primarily Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
um, where Yiddish was the native tongue of the neighborhood.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it was their language. It was a representation of where they came from, and it was the tongue that they spoke where they lived, and it was their tribe,
Mm-hmm.
and nowadays it is not spoken in Williamsburg or wherever.
Sure.
Uh, but
Maybe
I
select spaces, but
Yeah, no,
not on the street, as they say.
Mm-mm. But Maddie, who's the music teacher in the movie, she teaches Yiddish now
Mm.
in adult education in Westchester.
Oh, wow.
And they still teach it to the kids who are involved with Kinderland during the year.
Mm.
They have a shul, so it's like from camp to shul and from shul to camp, and they meet during the year and they learn Yiddish. It's not as big a part of the camp as it was back then, because I guess it's just not as big a part of our culture anymore.
Right.
But they keep it alive because it is our language. So I think there's something really beautiful about that.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I mean, you remarked on the interaction between the elders and the young, and both the campers and the counselors. I think in different scenes, that intergenerational discourse conversation is, to my mind at least, still kind of the holy grail for a lot of Jewish institutions in America, probably beyond America. But it felt like it happened so naturally there, and I feel like this is one of the questions you've at least half answered already. But I just, other than both current campers and counselors and the elders from the history of the camp, um, feeling very connected to what the camp is about, is there something else that helps make this work so well there? Because that's such a focus for so many Jewish organizations, is how can we engage the youth, and how can we connect them to the elders? And it felt, the way you presented things, like it's in the water there. I don't know. I don't know how much you can comment on why it works so well there.
Well, I don't know the details of the curriculum, but
Mm.
in the 70s, they worked really hard to
Mm.
create an educational curriculum
Mm.
that would support ways of having fun and learning at the same time.
Fun school, as one of the campers says, right?
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but it's
Yeah.
true. So I think music is a big key.
Mm.
Like Mike Maripol, who's in the movie, and he teaches songs,
Mm.
and they're camp songs, but they're labor songs, and then he'll tell the story of the songs,
Mm.
or they do the pajama game, and they do a musical that's, and I think also just the context of camp is a really great incubator for this kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff, because you have the kids' divided attention. There's no cell phones allowed. Nobody has
Mm-hmm.
a computer. And I also feel like there's a unique way that they give the kids voice. They empower them to have their own voice, and being different is actually a strength there. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
in most contexts, like I know I felt bullied and left out when I was in high school, and I never was very popular. But there, it's like if you don't fit, it's seen as kind of a treasure or a strength, and then they try to engage kids to build what they want it to be, their own curriculum. And yeah, I think that giving them a voice and then empowering them, it just seems that this is something that kids are really hungry for.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the fact that it's not religious, that it's really just about human and civil rights and cultural identity.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like they want to participate. And I think it also helps that, when their parents send them there at a younger age, because then they build friends and a community that is learning, they're all kind of learning the same thing together.
Mm-hmm.
And so these very long-term relationships are built. Many of the elders went to camp together, and they've been friends for 50, 60 years.
Wow.
And they live their lives based on humanist values. So it's instilled in an early age. I mean, the youngest one was 8. And also, I think a lot of the parents have gone to the camp or are progressive in their values. So I think what they learn is also being supported at home.
Right. Oh, that's crucial for sure.
And then it's not just in the summer, like it's all year long, like that group in New York City.
Okay.
And they meet once a month, and it's a social action group, a youth social action group. And, the kids are all involved in different causes. So they protest for climate change, some of them are trying to make affordable housing. It's just like to feel like you have that kind of agency at that age. I feel like they treat them like grown-ups. They treat them like they
I was
don't.
going to say a number of the kids, to me, and as someone who has a 6.5-year-old, a number of the kids, most of the kids, were talking like kids who believe they will be taken seriously. In other words, they're not talking like kids who are in an environment where what kids think and feel doesn't matter. They're talking like kids in an environment where what kids think and feel and believe really matters. And you can just tell that by both, I feel like the kind of the delight, but also I don't know, the like serious thought, just like, putting a lot of effort into as you say, expressing themselves articulately, and just they matter. They know that they matter, and that's so powerful. And as you kind of alluded to, it's all too rare, for there to be spaces like that.
I mean, even today, yeah, I think reflecting back at that age, that what they think and feel matters, is so powerful, because they're just very strong in themselves. They carry that with them, and it's transformative, I believe. So yeah.
Reminds me a little of, I mean, this is a very different stage of life, but I attended Oberlin College. And
oh, you did?
yeah, back in the late 90s. And what makes me think of that is, there were people who were Oberlin graduates or people outside that community who said, like, it's such a bubble. These young people are learning and doing things that once they get out into the real world, they're going to have a very rude awakening, because that's not how the world works. And I always thought, well, the only way they're going to change the world and make it better is if they get to practice in a kind of a laboratory setting and
it's true.
get into these.
And they also get to go out like during the year and go into, and they protest.
Yeah.
If they, so it's practiced both in the incubator and then out in the world. And so, yeah, I mean, that breeds success, right?
Right.
And I don't know that there are, I've never seen anything like this before, which was why I really wanted to make a film about it. I think they were really concerned that I hadn't gone to the camp and that an outsider could.
Mm-hmm.
And they I think eventually now they're thrilled, and they were like, well, maybe we did need an outsider because maybe you could see us more than we could see ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you need to be an objective party. But yeah, I mean, if I had a kid, I would send my kid there.
Same here. I bet you've had folks come to you and say, I wish it weren't in upstate New York because I live XYZ in this place and it's so far away, but this is where I would send my kid if it made sense.
Yeah, I mean, one of the producers sent her kid. She lives in Texas, and her kid was
Oh,
there.
wow.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of kids from California are there. So it is predominantly a Northeastern community, but there are kids that come from all over the place
Mm-hmm.
because I mean there are, I think, similar camps, but I don't know if they have the same. Yeah, there's something really unique about this camp. A lot of the camps, like the Workman's Circle camp, has just kind of become a more conventional Jewish
Mm-hmm.
camp. Just
Right.
it's not really grounded in the civil and social
Mm-hmm.
rights sort of activism. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I also, when we receive submissions for the festival or we seek out films, we see a lot of films that portray, in some way, religious Judaism, often Orthodox, because I feel like that's kind of a hot topic these days for various reasons. But and we also see plenty of films where the characters are Jewish, or some of them are Jewish, but their being Jewish isn't hugely important. A lot of Israeli films, for example, characters are Jewish and they're Israeli, but Jewishness isn't a major part of the story or whatever. But to see such a rich portrait of what secular, humanistic, however you want to call it, cultural Judaism, what that can be and mean, and what a place is like that is based on Jewish values, it was really meaningful for me, and I imagine for other people in the audience, as someone who myself identify as secular or culturally
Me too.
yeah.
That's why
and
for me
then
it was
and
just
then
so.
yeah, it's a concept that is particularly hard to explain to people who are not Jewish and don't have particular connection. So I really appreciated that because I often say, like, my organization here, Jewish Family Services, is based on Jewish values, but it's not religiously affiliated, right? And so it's nice to have a document of another institution that's the case for, right? It's definitely based on Jewish values, it has Jewish tradition and history, but it's not a religious place or a religious space.
Yeah, people don't understand that. And I didn't even really understand it, honestly. The kids taught me that.
Yeah.
I always thought that to claim my Judaism, I would have to be religious. And that's, I think, what kept me at a distance from my Judaism.
Mm-hmm. You're not alone there. It's yeah, it's a common conundrum, and anything that helps folks like me and you recognize that there are many ways to be Jewish and they don't all involve religious practice or faith, that it's a powerful thing. So
I think so too. I want more people to be aware of that, especially now. It's our cultural history and it's really rich.
mm-hmm. Is there anything that you can tell me and our audience about an interview, a moment, a theme or idea, or a song or something that you really liked, but that didn't end up making the final cut of the film?
God, there's so many things.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
might be hard to choose. Obviously, just one
One,
that comes to mind. Yeah.
Maddie, the music teacher, was telling the story of during the first Women's March, how she sang. Oh man, she sang a Yiddish song. I don't remember the song. It was a labor song, like an empowerment song in Yiddish, running backwards for the whole parade. for like she had to run backwards like to lead these women
Oh
in
my
this,
gosh.
to get their rights. She said she ran backwards for like 3 miles. Yeah, and
That's
I was like,
commitment.
thought that was
Wow.
pretty cool.
Yeah. My God.
Um, but also she sang this song. She's like, I don't know, this is kind of political, but she was like, if Trump is our leader, he shall be removed. If Trump is our leader, he shall be removed, just like the garbage floating down the wall. Like that.
Oh man.
I mean,
Okay.
there were a lot of moments. They're just these elders were just so incredible, so
Mhm.
incredible. Um, yeah. Judy's also such a trip. She's hysterical.
Mhm.
She's a big character in the movie.
Mhm.
She's funny. I tried to get a little bit of her funniness into the credits when
Oh yeah.
I was filming the Lenin statue, and she's like, I would like people to know that this is not the biggest part of my life.
That got a big laugh. Yeah. People really like that. Okay, I
Mhm.
only have two more questions for you, and it was going to be one, but now I got to hook into one of my
Okay.
questions from what you just said. So my feeling is, after watching many documentaries over the years, it's not generally possible to make a documentary that's politically neutral like that. I don't know that that's possible, but I am curious as to how you made decisions about how much to feature political statements within the film, considering how, among other things, political Camp Kinderland can be or can seem. Um, I don't feel personally, I don't feel like you were making political statements yourself, but I do feel like you captured some. How did you decide how political to to get in terms of the content?
I started out thinking it was a film about how the word socialism had been
Mm,
misdefined. That's not even a word. How it had been clouded and sort of like demonized
mm-hmm,
um, by our world or our
mm-hmm,
culture, anyway, in our culture. Um, and there's so many interesting political things that were said by these elders. I mean, they were involved in creating the 8-hour day, the 5-day week.
mm,
Um, they were involved in changing legislation. I mean, it's pretty insane. And
mm,
especially Dr. Zumov, some of the stuff that he told me politically,
mm,
it's just so juicy. I really wanted to use it. Um, and it and I did have a bunch of them, a bunch of that in the movie for a while.
mm,
But and yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from them. But I guess what I started to feel like after I filmed the kids was that I thought maybe I would, what was most powerful for me, like I had
mm,
to think about, which is really always hard when you're making a movie or writing a book. You have to really, really kind of boil it down to like,
mm,
what am I most interested in? Why am I telling this story?
mm,
And I think when I asked myself that question, I realized that it was the humanism. It was the sense of just being a decent human being and how that was so intrinsic to Jewish culture, being a
mm,
mensch, being a, like,
mm,
and I felt like that in a way was more powerful than really getting into the politics, because the minute you really get too political, people start to turn off. And
yeah.
even the word socialism, I had audience members who couldn't even,
Mhm.
some festivals wanted to take it, but the board wouldn't allow it because it talked about socialism and communism.
Well, so
So,
on that point, there are two things in the film that I really appreciated and that will stay with me and that I'll probably say in the future because it's so well articulated or so well expressed. One of them is the point, and I apologize for not knowing who says what throughout, but
don't worry about it.
one of the folks you talk to says socialism has become associated today with Stalin's gulags, right?
Mm.
And that is such a good way to capture how the fear-mongering, sort of McCarthyist style fear-mongering continues to this day, and maybe has had quite a resurgence really in the
Really
last
has.
decade or so. But also, I really appreciated the point, and it may have been the same speaker who said this. Some people are very afraid of socialism, but if you look at the Nordic countries and sort of democratic socialism, it's capitalism with the hard edges or hard corners sanded off. And I thought, that's exactly right. And so, like, that's just such a great encapsulation of why it's not necessary to be so afraid.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping, you
Yeah.
know, and that was Mike Mirapole, who's a brilliant author and historian who said tons of brilliant stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I thought that was a way, the way he said it just felt very palatable and very understandable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not, I'm sure it's not going to change people's minds, but I mean, I tried really hard to not, how can you not agree with like with like what these people are saying? You know what I mean? It was like I could have gone more into their political beliefs, but if I stuck to what humanly just made sense,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to be a good person or you just want to, you know, like most people, like Sandra, I think says at some point, want like freedom and equality and like,
Mm-hmm. Universal values,
yeah, yeah.
universal
So
needs.
I felt like if I could hone in on that first and then let the political stuff sort of be around,
Mm-hmm.
I would probably reach more people. And
Yours is one of a couple documentaries that we showed this year that I think if they hadn't been made so well, might
mhm.
have been more controversial. But because they were made so well, um, even people who didn't agree with some of the sentiments expressed weren't like really mad because this was a particular place and point of view from, but it wasn't, I don't know what the magic was, but it just, I think that you made it so carefully, and so it was provocative but not controversial in the way that something can be controversial when it just kind of throws stuff out there to provoke, right?
It's
That's not
interesting because like the work, no, the what is the Jewish paper, the Jewish Currents? They were like, it's too soft for us. We're not going to write
sure.
about it.
I love Jewish currents, but I see why they would say that. Yeah.
So it's so funny, like you just can't please everybody. But
No. I
um
am sad as someone who I think we have a pretty good selection committee over here in Spokane. I am sad that some festivals rejected it because of the role of socialism. And that makes me sad. But
well, I guess the sort of wealthy supporters of the festival have some say, and a lot of them didn't like the association
hmm,
of Judaism and socialism.
sure.
And
Yeah.
I just think that that's really short-sighted, and it scared me actually. Uh,
Hmm. Well,
really kind
it's historical revisionism to some extent, right?
of
Yeah.
scared me because yeah, they don't even remember who they fucking sorry.
That's okay. That's
I'm
okay. That's all right.
I'm on the Zoom call. They don't remember who they are,
Right. Right.
who they were, who their parents were,
Hmm.
and their grandparents, their parents. I mean,
And I
history.
think that's also, I mean, not to get into this whole thing, but I think that's also a broader problem in terms of people whose ancestors, grandparents, great grandparents immigrated, and it's hard for them to then have empathy for political refugees now, whatever. This is, yeah.
Also feels criminal to me.
Hmm.
I do like I try to say to my mother, who's Republican and probably somewhat racist. I mean, I try to talk to her about it, and I say, Grandma was an immigrant and she came from Russia, and we didn't have anything,
Mm.
and she's just so far removed from it.
Hmm.
She doesn't want to remember, and I think
Yeah.
my grandparents didn't want to remember. That's part of why I never learned that you could be a secular Jew.
Mm. And part of that probably goes to generational trauma and not wanting
I
to
think that's I
remember
think
for that reason. Yeah.
I think
Um,
that's I think that's true. And I think maybe my mother's generation just got a bad a bad piece of that. Maybe our generation is actually starting to want to know more about our history, you
and the
know?
next younger generation, particularly, I think,
Yeah,
in theory, anyway, some of them. Yeah.
some of them. Yeah, you got to make it fun.
Yes, that's the key. So I have a final question for you, and it's a pretty typical final question. So apologies for that. But what is next for you? What directing, producing, other filmmaking projects are you working on now, or can we expect to see from you in the not too distant future?
Yeah, I'm writing this memoir that we
Mm.
talked about in the beginning. Quadrangle is a movie about my crazy family and about my experience growing up in a group marriage on Long Island in the 70s. And
Oh
so,
wow! What
yeah.
about you?
And it was a very, very popular documentary.
Hmm.
It kind of fulfills a lot of people's fantasies, I
Hmm.
think, about like what would happen. The group marriage did not work out, as many of them do not. And the documentary is told from my parents' perspective,
Hmm.
and again, had to be done very carefully. But it's a lot of fun, and I never got to tell the story from my perspective and from the kids' perspective of what it was like to grow up in the late 60s in an alternative family. So I'm working pretty hard on that.
Hmm.
And I'm also trying to get it set up at another network as a fictional television.
Hmm.
So
Wow!
yeah, so I've been
Exciting.
busy. I'm also in the process of my film about Ukraine that I made in 91 during the fall of communism when Ukraine got their national independence.
Hmm.
I've actually been following those characters during the war. So
Oh wow!
yeah, it's been pretty
Hmm.
heavy. Uh, and so trying to update my film and
Hmm.
get it a little bit more visibility. But I've been filming them over Zoom, but it's been a little bit hard during the winter because a lot of them don't have electricity. And also I just feel like I need to be really sensitive because they're really in a survival place. And maybe they don't want a movie made about it right now.
Sure.
But I'm trying to kind of stay in touch with them.
Hmm.
That's another labor of love, that one.
Yeah, you're busy.
Kind of busy, yeah. Too busy, not making money. Too
Oh,
busy. But um a lot of uh a lot of projects. I hope to sort of work on another documentary, but something has to really grip me.
hmm.
And I'm kind of just exploring now while I'm doing this other work.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Amy, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think it would be good for the audiences to know, or that, it's important for people to keep in mind about the film?
Um, I don't know that there's anything in particular, but I guess I just think it's important to uphold the values in the film,
Hmm.
and I guess I'd just like to express my gratitude to the elders who shared because they lived through the McCarthy era. And
Yeah,
yeah,
when there's the brief moment when McCarthy appears on screen and speaks right in the archival footage, and I half expected our audience to boo or hiss, but they did not do that. I think probably because they think that's not good manners to do. But I kind of wondered if anyone would do that.
well, I really hope like the film. I'm hoping that educators learn about it because it
Mm,
doesn't have a distribution like Quadrangle had it on HBO because it's not sexy like that. But and because of its length. So I have an educational distributor called Film Platform, and
Mhm.
it'd just be amazing for people to reach out and for their institutions to license the film, because I think it's an important film and I want kids to see it. I
Well,
want
I
people.
should mention, so one of our rabbis in town who teaches the sort of weekly teen uh, Jewish education classes is interested in doing just that, is interested in showing it to her class. And so I think that could be a really great, I don't know, just a jumping off point for a lot of good discussions. And I think teens, in my opinion, it may resonate very much for them,
I feel
even
that way.
though our community here is very distant in many ways culturally and otherwise from, East Coast, upstate New York kind of vibe. Still, there are things that particularly Jewish progressive teens, but just Jewish teens in general who are trying to learn about their culture and tradition that are important to them. I think it'll be a great tool for that purpose. So
Yeah, so I've had a challenge. I don't know how to really get that going. I know I have
mm,
an educational distributor, but I don't really know a lot of educators that are interested in this particular subject. So,
mhm.
yeah, if anybody is interested in showing it in their academic environment or knows someone, please tell them about it.
Will do. Will do.